Saul in Michmash and in the hill country of Bethel, while 1,000 were with Jonathan at Gibeah of Benjamin, but he sent away the rest of the people, each to his tent. Jonathan smote the garrison of the Philistines that was in Geba. Apparently an important town in the heartland of Israel, and the Philistines are in control of it. So we talked about the fact last week that the Philistines really had Israel under their thumbs at this point in their history. They were dominating Israel economically, politically, militarily. And Saul has now raised this army of 3,000 Israelites to sort of take the fight back to the Philistines, and the campaign begins with the king's son Jonathan taking the garrison that is at Geba. So verse 3 continues, and the Philistines heard of it. Then Saul blew the trumpet throughout the land, saying, let the Hebrews hear. All Israel heard the news that Saul had smitten the garrison of the Philistines, and also that Israel had become odious to the Philistines. So the Philistines were obviously quite enraged about this, and they were going to respond. So the people were then summoned, to Saul at Gilgal. Gilgal at this is a location actually to the east around Jericho. So the people come and they gather. Well, the Philistines assembled, verse 5 says, to fight with Israel, 30,000 chariots, 6,000 horsemen, and people like the sand that is on the seashore in abundance. And they came up and camped at Michmash, east of Beth Aven. So now they've taken this garrison, they've had this initial victory in this renewed fight against their Philistine oppressors, but the Philistines have gathered together a massive army, to say the least. I mean, really, not just for those, for those days, but really for any time in history. This is a massive military undertaking, okay? No matter what kind of standard you want to put to it. And so they're going to come against Israel, and apparently they're going to just try to wipe them out or complete their conquest. Well, the story goes on that before the battle ensues, Saul wants to receive the Lord's blessing on what they do. And so he's waiting on Samuel to come and offer a sacrifice, but Samuel's nowhere to be seen. And so what does Saul decide to do? I'm going to offer the sacrifice myself. I'm going to offer the burnt offering. I'm going to offer the fellowship offerings. And we're going to get this thing done because Samuel is nowhere around. Now, why is he doing that? Okay, what's kind of the precipitating cause? All right, he needs to go to battle, but something else is going on as well. Yes, so verse 8, if you look at verse 8 of chapter 13, now he waited 7 days according to the appointed time set by Samuel, but Samuel did not come to Gilgal, and the people were scattering from him. He's got this force. It's nowhere near large enough by human standards to take on this massive Philistine army, but even what he has begun to dwindle. So he's worried. I bring that up because I want you to keep it in mind for the next part of this story, because I think you're going to see something important in the narrative as it regards his son Jonathan. And we also saw last week, if you'll remember, that there's no blacksmith in Israel. So the people have to go to the Philistines to get their tools sharpened. There's no spears, right? There's no swords. The only ones who have these metal instruments of war are the Philistines, right? So the Israelites have to use something different. So you see, for example, what does David use? A slingshot, okay? So they've got weapons, just nothing that's, no kind of technology like what the Philistines are putting on the battlefield. And any questions before we move on into chapter 14? That's the situation, that's sort of the setting for what's about to happen. Now let me just go ahead. I don't know how far into chapter 14 we're going to make it. There's a lot that takes place in 14. But there's something that happens in this chapter that's kind of a head scratcher. I'm just going to go ahead and be honest. It's sort of hard to understand why it happens the way it happens and so forth. Actually, the next couple of chapters, 14 and 15 of 1 Samuel, are going to present us with some difficulties, things that we're going to have to think through, okay? I mean, up till now, the narrative has been pretty straightforward, right? I mean, I think it's been pretty clear to all of us what's going on. But there's some things that are going to happen in the next couple of chapters that truly are kind of head scratchers, all right? So I'll do my best to try to walk us through this, but I just want you to know that you ought to put your thinking caps on, okay? Well, let's start chapter 14, verse 1. Now the day came that Jonathan, the son of Saul, said to the young man who was carrying his armor, "Come, let us cross over to the Philistines' garrison that is on the other side." But he did not tell his father. That's an interesting point to note. It's hard to be certain why he didn't tell his father. It almost seems as though there's something of a rift that's developed between Jonathan and Saul, as we're going to have reason to note later on in chapter 14. Question?
At this point, has the romance between Jonathan and David developed already?
The romance?
Romance.
Oh, no, they're not friends yet. No, David will not enter the picture until chapter 16. All right, so it seems like there might at this point be some sort of rift developing between Saul or Jonathan and his father. Why? Well, it might be, and I floated this last week. Again, I can't be certain, right? I can't tell you that it's certainly the case. But if you'll remember, when Jonathan took Geba with his detachment from the army, you remember Saul says, "Blow the trumpets and let all the Hebrews hear." And what did the Hebrews hear? That Saul had taken the fort rather than Jonathan. And so we talked about, well, is this because Saul's the king, Saul is the father? Could very well be. Could very well be. Or it could be that Saul is taking credit for something he did not do. He did not lead the charge that took that Philistine garrison, but perhaps he is making people think that he did and taking all the credit away from his son. That is in keeping with Saul's character, because when David enters the picture and David starts fighting, you remember there's the little jingle that the people are singing when Saul and David come back from their great victories, and Saul has slain his thousands and David his what? Tens of thousands. And it enrages Saul, right? Because David is getting all of this credit, but he's just, who is he? Okay, he slew Goliath, but Saul's the king, right? Saul should be getting far more credit than just some shepherd boy. So it is definitely in keeping with Saul's character that he would, become jealous that others are getting accolades that he's not himself getting for things he did not do. But again, it's hard to be certain. It's hard to be certain at this point. But it does seem, if you read between the lines, okay, why isn't he telling his father about this? Why is he doing something, taking the initiative on his own? So it seems like there might be some sort of rift developing. All right, so back to chapter 14, verse 2. Saul was staying in the outskirts of Gibeah. This is in the tribe of Benjamin. It's just to the north of Jerusalem, if you kind of know where Jerusalem is. Jerusalem will become the capital city of Israel. Gibeah at this point seems to be the capital, though. All right, because this is where Saul has set up shop, as it were. So Saul was staying in the outskirts of Gibeah under the pomegranate tree, which is in Migron. And the people who were with him were about 600 men. Seems like his army has shrunk considerably by this point. And Ahiah, the son of Ahitub, Ichabod's brother, the son of Phinehas, the son of Eli, the priest of the Lord at Shiloh, was wearing an ephod. So he has a group of men with him, fighting men. He's also got a priest with him, okay? A priest who's wearing the priestly garments, the ephod. And the people did not know that Jonathan had gone, that Jonathan is now taking the fight, just him and his armor bearer, the guy who carries his equipment for him, because remember, only Saul and Jonathan have this metal fighting equipment. You remember? Only the king and the king's son, the king and the crown prince. Nobody else has this. So he's got this armor bearer with him who's carrying his armor, and he says, look, let's just go on up and take care of some more Philistines at this garrison, at this fort that they've established. So nobody knows what's going on. Well, verse 4, between the passes by which Jonathan sought to cross over to the Philistines' garrison, there was a sharp crag on the one side, a sharp crag on the other. So they're in this sort of ditch area, and there's two cliffs on either side. They're kind of in this valley, two cliffs on either side. And the name of the one was Bozez, the name of the other, Seneh. The one crag rose on the north opposite Michmash, the other on the south opposite Geba. So they're close by, relatively, where they were originally. Then Jonathan said to the young man who was carrying his armor, "Come and let us cross over to the garrison of these uncircumcised Philistines. Perhaps the Lord will work for us." Now, don't miss this. Because the Lord is not restrained to save by many or by few. What does that mean? The Lord is not restrained to save by many or by few. What's he saying? Bill?
He's saying that the battle does not belong to the number of men, but to the Lord, or just one man, Samson with a jawbone of a donkey, or 100 men can take on 300,000 if they've got the Lord on their side.
Okay. Joe, what were you going to say? Same thing. Okay. That's right. That's absolutely right. Why would this be important for us to note, for the narrator to tell us, do you think? Because who in the previous chapter was worried about the number of the size of his military? Saul. Saul takes it upon himself to offer a sacrifice, something he is expressly forbidden to do. He's not a priest. He's the king. He's not a Levite. He's from the tribe of Benjamin. But he sees that the force that he has is shrinking rapidly because the people are scared to death of this massive Philistine army. Well, here's Jonathan at this point, who takes just his personal assistant, right? Like his squire in medieval times. That's what they were called, right? A knight had his squire who sort of carried his stuff and helped him. He's got his assistant, his armor bearer. It's just the two of them. And he says, look, why don't we go and continue this battle? Maybe the Lord will come to our assistance, because it doesn't matter if there's a lot of us, if there's a few of us. If God's in this thing, we're going to win. So already we see a sharp contrast between Jonathan and Saul. Saul is not a man of faith. Jonathan is. At least this account would indicate such. And it could just be that he's gone off on his own. Again, there could be a rift developing here, and it could also just be simply because he says, look, my dad is not the guy who's going to lead this thing. He doesn't have the faith to do it. So he takes his one armor bearer, and he goes up against this garrison. Verse 7, his armor bearer said to him, "Do all that is in your heart. Turn yourself, and here I am with you according to your desire." Whatever you want, I'm with you. Then Jonathan said, "Behold, we will cross over to the men and reveal ourselves to them. If they say to us, 'Wait until we come to you,' then we will stand in our place and not go up to them. But if they say, 'Come up to us,' then we will go up, for the Lord has given them into our hands, and this shall be the sign to us." So somehow he kind of comes up with this idea. Listen, if they come down to us, we won't do anything apparently. But if they tell us to come up the cliff to them, well, then we'll know that God's on our side. Okay, now, I don't know if we have any military tacticians in the crowd tonight, but does this sound like a smart military move to you? You've got a fortified Philistine position on a hill. You've got two men, just two, going up against a fortified position on a hill. On the best of days, with a sizable military force, that would be very difficult to do, would it not? They're on a hill, they're fortified. But here you got two people, just two, going up against a Philistine garrison on a hill attacking. And he says, look, I think that this is going to be God's sign to us. If they tell us to, well, come on, guys, just let's see what you got. You feeling froggy? Jump. You know, there's nothing separating us but air and willpower, right? If you're feeling froggy, just go ahead and jump. He says, that'll be the sign that the Lord's going to do it for us. And yet the armor bearer's like, oh, okay, whatever you want, man, I'll do it. It's supposed to kind of strike you as odd, right? This whole endeavor, like, wow, okay. This guy really does trust the Lord. I mean, really. His dad couldn't even wait for the prophet to come and offer a sacrifice. That's how scared to death he was. Jonathan's like, no, we can do it. God's with us, no problem. Already there's a distinction being made between father and son. Verse 11, when both of them revealed themselves to the garrison of the Philistines said, behold, Hebrews are coming out of the holes where they have hidden themselves. So they're mocking them at this point. Look, couple of Israelites, couple of Hebrews, because remember, they're taken to the hills, right? They're scared to death. And here are these two that just come up and they're just mocking. Well, here they are. They're crawling out of the holes where they have hidden themselves. So the men, verse 12, of the garrison hailed Jonathan and his armor bearer and said, come up to us and we will tell you something, or we will show you something. And Jonathan said to his armor bearer, come up after me, for the Lord has given them into the hands of Israel. So they taunt Jonathan and his armor bearer. Come on up here, we'll show you something. You want to take us on? Come right on ahead. Jonathan says, okay, you got it. Verse 13, then Jonathan climbed up on his hands and feet with his armor bearer behind him. In other words, that's how steep this hill is that he's got to get up. And they fell before Jonathan, and his armor bearer put some to death after him. That first slaughter which Jonathan and his armor bearer made was about 20 men within about half a furrow in an acre of land. And there was a trembling in the camp, in the field, and among all the people. Even the garrison and the raiders trembled, and the earth quaked, so that it became a great trembling. Now Saul's watchmen in Gibeah of Benjamin looked, and behold, the multitude melted away, and they went here and there. Saul said to the people who were with him, number now and see who has gone from us. And when they numbered, behold, Jonathan and his armor bearer were not there. And Saul said to Ahiah, bring the ark of God here, because the ark of God, the ark of the covenant, was at that time with the sons of Israel. When Saul talked to the priests, the commotion in the camp of the Philistines continued and increased. So Saul said to the priests, withdraw your hand. Then Saul and all the people who were with him rallied and came to the battle. And behold, every man's sword was against his fellow, and there was very great confusion. Now the Hebrews who were with the Philistines previously, who went up with them all around in the camp, even they also turned to be with the Israelites who were with Saul and Jonathan. When all the men of Israel who had hidden themselves in the hill country of Ephraim heard that the Philistines had fled, even they also pursued them closely in the battle. So the Lord saved Israel that day, and the battle spread beyond Beth-aven. There's a great commotion. God throws this panic among the Philistines. That's actually the way it could be translated, that there's this, it says there's a great panic among the Philistines. It's literally like it could be a panic from God. You could translate it that way. So God throws this commotion among the people, and they're terrified. And so they begin to turn on one another. And the text tells us that there are some Israelites who have actually defected. They've turned their coats, and they've gone over to the Philistine side. Perhaps some of the very ones who initially thought Saul will never be able to deliver us. Remember those people who did not think that Saul was the right man for the job? Well, whoever they were, there's some Israelites who have gone over to the Philistine army to fight with them. Well, once they see that there's no hope for the Philistines anymore, they say, look, we're back with Israel, which leads to further commotion and further chaos as men within their own ranks are turning against them. All right? And so the text tells us in verse 23 that the Lord literally saved Israel that day, and the battle spread beyond Beth-aven. Well, now we understand, of course, that God saves as God wishes to save, but the issue in the text has always been upon the faithfulness of the one that God calls to lead the people. So the question here is, whose faith is God responding to by bringing deliverance? It's certainly not Saul's, because there's nothing but faithlessness in the case of Saul. And so who is it whose faith has brought this blessing to Israel? It's Jonathan. It's Jonathan. Any questions or comments before we move on? It's pretty clear so far. This is where the waters get a little bit, shall we say, murky. All right, we're not going to go for too much longer. We're going to get out of here a little bit early tonight, but we'll at least start this last part of the story with Saul's foolish vow. So the battle has ensued. The Israelites are at this point routing the Philistine army. Well, now the narrator is going to sort of back up a little bit and give us a little bit of information about what's going on and what Saul has decided in his foolishness to do. So verse 24 picks up, "Now the men of Israel were hard pressed on that day, for Saul had put the people under oath, saying, 'Cursed be the man who eats food before evening, and until I have avenged myself on my enemies.'" Very important, those pronouns. "Until I have avenged myself on my enemies." So none of the people tasted food. What's going on? What's going on? Somebody summarize that for me. What has Saul at this point enjoined every member of his army to refrain from doing? Eating. Why? Or let me ask it this way. Eating until when? Right. Eating before evening, so before night falls, and until I have avenged myself on my enemies. So once again, where's Saul's focus? On himself, right? On himself. The big thing for Saul is always Saul. The key thing for Saul is, number one, Saul. So for Saul, this whole battle is about his glory. It's about the advancement of his kingdom, the strengthening of his dynasty. And he's probably looking around at what's going on here. And you remember, God has already told him through Samuel, look, your time is done. Because you have rebelled against me like this, taken it upon yourself to do something you knew you were not supposed to do. You have committed treason, willful, brazen act of disobedience and offering these sacrifices. Your kingdom is over. I am going to raise up somebody after my own heart. I have sought out, God says, someone after my own heart, which is, of course, is going to be David. But maybe at this point, Saul's heart is just getting harder and harder, and he sees. Remember, he doesn't know what Jonathan has done. He doesn't know that Jonathan has just killed 20 Philistines with just his armor bearer standing next to him. That he has charged a Philistine fort. He doesn't know about this. And so he's just sitting there going, wow, what's going on here? Look, I mean, these guys are in commotion. It's high time that we go after them. He probably thinks, well, maybe God didn't mean what he said, or maybe God changed his mind, or who cares about what God thinks? I'm going to do it. I'm going to do this and save Israel on my own anyway. They're my enemies. It only matters that I myself am avenged. And so he tells the people, you cannot eat until the day is done, because at evening, according to Jewish reckoning, that was the start of the new day. Sun goes down, that's the new day, until sundown the next day. So until this day is over, you cannot eat until I have avenged myself fully on my enemies. Now imagine yourself in the Middle East, fighting a war, fighting a battle on foot all day long, and you can't eat. That's pretty rough, right? Well, why is he doing this? Is he doing this because he doesn't want the people to stop to eat? That he wants them to completely rout the Philistines? Perhaps. Does he think that maybe this is something that's going to impress God? God, look at what I told my soldiers to do, to fast. See how spiritual we are? For whatever reason he did this, the text is going to indicate to us it was just another act of absolute foolishness. God nowhere indicated in his law that the soldiers of Israel were not to eat on the days that they were fighting these wars. This is something conceived of by Saul, and his son is going to recognize that and provide the decisive critique of what he's doing. So verse 25, all the people of the land entered the forest, and there was honey on the ground. Just to tempt them a little bit, I suppose, right? There's all this honey everywhere. When the people entered the forest, behold, there was a flow of honey, but no man put his hand to his mouth, for the people feared the oath. They feared being cursed, killed, cut off for doing this. Verse 27, but Jonathan had not heard when his father put the people under oath. Therefore, he put out the end of the staff that was in his hand and dipped it in the honeycomb and put his hand to his mouth, and his eyes brightened. That's just a way of saying he became vigorous. His strength was regained, right? He gets a sugar rush. Blood sugar's low, eats some honey, he feels good to go for a little bit longer. Well, verse 28, then one of the people said, your father strictly put us under oath, saying, cursed be the man who eats food today. And the people were weary. Then Jonathan said, my father has troubled the land. See now how my eyes have brightened because I tasted a little of this honey. How much more, verse 30, if only the people had eaten freely today of the spoil of their enemies which they found. For now the slaughter among the Philistines has not been great. What does that mean? We could have killed a whole lot more of them if he had allowed us to eat. If he had just allowed us to have some food. But this is interesting what he says here in verse 29. My father has troubled the land. Do you see that? Do you see that? This is yet another indication that things are not all right back home. That some sort of rift has most likely developed between Saul and Jonathan, because this is very strong language that Jonathan is using here. My father has troubled the land. He has troubled Israel. This same word, it's only used about 13 times in the Old Testament, this Hebrew term translated troubled. It recalls to mind the sin of Achan. Do you guys remember? Can somebody bring us up to speed? The book of Joshua, the sin of Achan. Anybody remember Achan's sin? The battle of Ai or the battle of Ai?
He's the one that stole plunder and hid it in his tent.
Yes. So God told the people, you're supposed to wipe Ai out, or Ai is really how it's pronounced. You're not to take anything. Well, you got this guy who takes some of the spoils and hides it. Joshua tells him, you have troubled Israel. Why have you troubled Israel? So Saul, according to his son Jonathan, has essentially put himself in the place of really being something like an enemy of the people. There's no reason you should have done this. This was utter foolishness. What would have entered your mind to tell the people that are risking their lives for you that they're not allowed to eat until your honor is avenged on your enemies? I thought they were God's enemies. I thought you were a servant of the people. I thought the whole reason why God raised you up was to protect the people. And here you are, all you care about is being avenged on your enemies, and so you hamstring your own people. And you threaten to kill them if they do so much as eat on a day when they would really need the food. So Jonathan sees this foolishness for what it is and calls it out. My father has troubled the land. Again, very strong language. Not just my father has caused a little bit of an issue. No, my father has put himself in the place of an enemy. His foolishness is impacting us greatly. He is a detriment to the nation, just like Achan was a detriment in his act of rebellion during the battle of Ai. Any questions or further comments? We'll leave the story there and we'll pick it up. But do you see what's happening so far? You have a man, Jonathan, who is more faithful than his father. And in addition to being more faithful than his father, he is also a very much wiser man than his father is. But what did God say about the house of Saul? It's coming down. It's coming down. So we read about this man, and I don't know about you, but it almost makes you wish, right? Man, wouldn't he make a better king than his father? And yet we see, don't we, how our sin affects a lot of people around us, has the potential to, just like Saul's did. Just like Saul's did. Saul's sin led to the downfall of his house. His descendants would not rule, including a man that we see to be very much qualified to do so. Sometimes our sin has great effects even beyond us, right? And so Jonathan is now going to be a pretty prominent character that we're going to see, and as we were reminded, one who is very close to David. And so we'll see a lot out of Jonathan. Was there a hand back here I saw? Yeah. Yes, I do. I do. We're gonna see in actually just a moment. It's funny that you bring that up. It's going to happen in just a moment in the story. Saul rather, is going to go to God for a word, for advice, for direction on what to do, and God's going to be silent. And one of the commentators that I was reading on this text made the point that God had already told the people through Samuel, when the people first asked for a king, God says, look, the king is not going to be all that you think he is, because you're asking for the wrong kind of king. He's going to be in it for himself. He's not going to be the Savior that you think he is. And he says, in the day that you call out to me, I will not answer you. And so, yes, this is judgment. This is further judgment, absolutely. And yet, in all of it, God is nonetheless still gracious to his people, because as we read in verse 23, the Lord saved Israel that day. And so even in the midst of this, we see the Lord's graciousness. Obviously, the Lord's not going to allow the Philistines to wipe Israel off the map. God has plans for Israel in the future and plans for Israel's king, but we also see that things are not all right. And we see the cracks and the fissures already beginning to form, even within Saul's own household. Okay? All right, any further? Yes?
Is Jonathan breaking the commandment to honor his father?
That's the head scratcher. No, he's not. But we'll have, that's part of the head scratcher. He's not, because the text is very clear that he didn't know about it. And it takes great pains to tell us about that. He didn't know about it. He is also...
He said, my father's troubled the people.
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought you meant when he ate the honey. So was he breaking what?
He's speaking against his father to the...
Yeah, I don't think so. I mean, I think he's just calling it like, he's not cursing his father. He's just simply saying this was not the right thing to do. Our victory today could have been much greater, which could have translated into more people killed. And of course, the issue is not, well, we're just going to kill more people because we're bloodthirsty, but the Philistines were a threat. And so you weed out the Philistines, you lessen the persistent existential threat that is constantly facing Israel. So he says, look, it could have been a greater victory, and it could have meant more security for Israel in the future. And but because he's done this, it has greatly affected us. He has troubled us, troubled the land.
It seems like he's pulling an Absalom, like when he said, if I were king, you'd get
Right,
justice.
right. But notice he never usurps his father in the whole time. He never does it. And I think that his righteousness, his faithfulness is shining through in these moments. So yeah, Absalom went the whole way of actually raising his hand against the Lord's anointed. So, good question, good point. Okay, anything else? Well, brothers and sisters, good to be with you. Let me pray for us tonight. We'll be dismissed. Our Father, thank you for allowing us once again to be together to continue to look at this unfolding story of Saul. There's a lot, obviously, for us here, Father, in this tragic tale of the first king of Israel. A lot for us to learn about how you often do give us what we want, and it turns out not to be the thing we really think we wanted or thought we needed. And Saul is proof positive of that, but now we've been introduced to a positive figure, this young man, Jonathan, who was very much unlike his father. He trusted in you. He followed after you. What an example for us that would be in the midst of danger, to simply say, the Lord delivers. It's in the Lord's hands. we can trust in the Lord. But we also know, Father, of the far-reaching consequences of sin. That Saul's act of high-handed rebellion, it led to the downfall of his house. It did affect his son. And so, Father, may we then look at all of this, and as Paul said in his letters, to take them as examples for us. But of course, to remember that the main thing is you are working in the history of these rebellious Israelites to do what you told Abraham you were going to do, and that's bless the world through them. Bless the world through the King of Israel, who would be this man after your own heart, whose descendant, as 2 Samuel 7 tells us, his descendant would sit on that throne forever. And we know that he has come. His name is Jesus, the son of Abraham and the son of David. He is our King. He is our Messiah. And he is the one who has rescued and redeemed us. And so, Father, thank you for the gospel. I pray that you'd go with us now, that you'd bring us back at the next appointed time, that we may once again fellowship with one another, pray to you, offer up our thanksgivings, and be in your word together here as the people that you've assembled as Grace Bible Church in this place. And so go with us now, again, we pray, and enable us, Father, to live in obedience and faithfulness to you, your word, your will. And Lord, we will trust you in all things, or we will strive to do so. Help us, Father. Help us to put to death the deeds of the flesh each and every day. In Christ's name, amen. All right. Y'all have a great rest of your week.